Mr Speaker. Kia ora.
Mr Speaker.
I understand the next call is a split call. Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I acknowledge the fine words from the member who's just resumed her seat. I wish National Party conservation policy even vaguely reflected the words that she just spoke. Unfortunately, it does not, and this bill doesn't do any of the things that she was talking about, which is not to say it's not a good bill and we shouldn't be supporting it, because we are, and I don't want to take away from Jackie Dean's fine moment, but none of the fine things that were being spoken about in that speech are being achieved by this bill, and none of them are to be found in the conservation policy direction of this national government. But I hope that Claudette Hoiti takes up a more senior role within the National Party so that she can further those conversations, because she obviously has a lot to contribute. Look, this bill, as I think Eugenie Sage says, is some tinkering around the edges, which is positive, but that's all it is. And really, I would say to the government members who've been speaking so passionately about how wonderful this is, if it's that wonderful, why didn't you put it in government legislation? Why did you leave it to a member's bill, put it in a ballot, at the whim of the ballot, and then go through a process which is much slower because we only have members' days every 2 weeks? If this is as important and crucial and game-changing as the National Party is making out, then why didn't they make it a government bill? Why didn't they make it a government bill? And I'll tell you why, is because they want to block up the members' ballot so that Labour Party and Green Party bills, which will actually do something about conservation in this country, don't get drawn. So that's why this bill is being dealt with on a members' day instead of on a government day, which is where it could have been dealt with far more quickly than through this process. But as I said, not wanting to take away from Jackie Dean's fine moment in the sun, congratulate her for bringing this to the House. But if the National Party really cared about conservation, this wouldn't be a members' bill. I just make that point, Mr Speaker.
That's right.
I want to also raise the concern that penalties are only as good as enforcement. So it's all very well, you can have the biggest, you can have a $1 trillion penalties, but if you don't have the enforcement capability, it means absolutely nothing. And our concern is that through the cuts we've seen, where 1 in 6 conservation staff have lost their jobs, $54 million drop in budget over 4 years, is what is that going to do to the capability of DOC staff to actually enforce the penalties that we're putting in place here? Because they're only as good as our ability to enforce them, and we have serious concerns that the National Party has, on the one hand, lifted penalties, and on the other hand, taken away the ability to actually police those penalties and enforce them. And that's not just actually in invoked conservation, it's actually in terms of the funding for biosecurity, which is also being cut, and my colleague Damien O'Connor has raised consistently in the House concerns around our ability to police biosecurity, which has to be one of the most important things for an agriculture-based economy. And so it's all very well to raise penalties. It means nothing if the enforcement capability isn't there. The other thing I want to raise is that the promoter of this bill has said that she wants to see New Zealand's wildlife, natural and historic resources better protected. And again, that's a very laudable vision, but I have to look at what's happening in the conservation estate, Mr Speaker, in terms of the granting of half of the decision-making powers over oil and gas and minerals exploration in the conservation estate, handing half those decision-making powers over to the Minister of Energy. And I wonder whether the Minister of Energy is going to be subject to the penalties under this piece of legislation if, in fact, he approves a project that results in unlawful reduction of wildlife, harming of wildlife in the conservation estate, given that they've now and I have to say, when you saw Minister Bridges' performance on Campbell Live last week, I don't have a whole lot of confidence that he's ever going to say no to a mining company. I don't think there's a mining company he's going to say no to in this world, and I think that that's a deep concern. That's one of the reasons why Labour will be repealing that role of the Minister of Energy, is because as someone who works in the mining sector, he cannot be seen as neutral in making those decisions, as opposed to the Minister of Conservation, who was there to protect and preserve the conservation estate. That's the appropriate person to be making those decisions. Will he be subject to these penalties if the activities that he is approving, or she, if that changes, result in the kind of infringements that Jackie Dean is trying to address here in this piece of legislation? I just want to finish off, Mr Speaker, by pointing out that the biggest threat to our conservation estate is in fact pests, and in fact only 1/8 of our conservation estate is currently being actively controlled for weasels, for stoats, for possums. If the government was serious about protecting the conservation estate, they would do something about the funding for the Department of Conservation and increase their ability and their capability for pest management, which would also be great for biosecurity and for the protection of our agriculture industry when it comes to bovine TB and other such things. But we will be supporting this bill, and congratulations to Jackie Dean.
I call Catherine Delahunty.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I'll just take a brief call on this bill, which